Our moderator is Ian Masters, who's going to introduce Frank Schaeffer. Ian is a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who's covered national security affairs for over 25 years on public radio. He's the host of Background Briefing and Live from the Left Coast on KPFK, which are heard on Sundays from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. And he has a new daily drive time show called Daily Briefing at 5 p.m. Monday through Thursday. So tune in for that. Ian's been a senior fellow at UCLA Center for Strategic and International Affairs and the UCLA Center for International Relations, and was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. So please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
Well, thank you, Claudia, and thank all of you for coming here tonight. Thomas Jefferson said, "Information is the currency of democracy." If so, then today we have counterfeit conspiracy on the left and bankrupt religious certainty on the right. Things fall apart, the poet Yeats wrote. The center cannot hold. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Our national discourse and the Republican Party, it would seem, is dominated by Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, and Glenn Beck. And today, Sarah Palin is yet again in the headlines and all over television. Where are the best in America? The rational, the reasonable? Are they silent or are they not being heard? Since most of our information comes from television, which produces an almost identical homogenized news product that mirrors the two-party system, we are afflicted by the hollow notion that the universe of discourse is limited to two black and white positions that discourage empirical thinking and corrupt our ability to reason. And it follows that the mainstream media's ideology of objectivity and balance, with thesis, antithesis, synthesis, pro, con, then a meaningless mush, has contributed to decades of denial about the dangers of global warming, while allowing creationism to be presented as the other side of evolution, leading inevitably to the absurd logic of balancing a Holocaust survivor with a Holocaust denier. Are we so fair and balanced that we cannot stand up and say that over 30% of our fellow Americans are ignorant, if not insane, to believe that the world was created 6,000 years ago and that the dinosaurs somehow did not rock the boat on Noah's Ark? Maybe we are living in troubled times, but surely it is irresponsible, if not criminally insane, to destroy the environment because it is about to end in the rapture anyway. Why have children then, not to mention bestowing rights on the fetus while taking them away from the mother? And if all life is to end soon, what does the right to life mean while we celebrate and await the dawn of death? Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. Little wonder the looming issues of the day, such as unwinnable wars, global environmental endangerment, national bankruptcy, statewide implosion, and civic disintegration, are overwhelmed by the tawdry personal scandals of hypocritical politicians and indulgent celebrities. Are we so politically correct and enslaved by religious tolerance that we cannot speak out against the heresy of spiritual pornography that celebrates the end of the world with eager anticipation? An apocalypse that has our world ending as our flesh burns in a lake of fire so that their world can begin? Second only to Harry Potter, 60 million copies of the End of Time books have been sold in America. So this is not a fringe movement. With real unemployment at 20% and perhaps permanent, while the divide between rich and poor increases, will the demagogues on the right with their echo chambers preaching reactionary dogma dressed up as religion lead us to a more just, peaceful, and godly world? Or will the anger and bitter hatred spewing from the airwaves and pulpits divide black against white, gay against straight, immigrant against the unemployed, us against them? And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? And what if one of the many armed and dangerous amongst the town hall disrupting teabaggers, Berthas and Birches who show up at the presidential speeches with assault rifles? What if one of them takes a shot at our president? Will Rush Limbaugh be put on trial? The Reverend Hagee, Pat Robertson, Glenn Beck, or his enabler, Rupert Murdoch? Maybe we do need the second coming to show us how we have fallen from grace. We need the Prince of Peace to return to sort out this mess and drive off the money changers and revive the Sermon on the Mount and restore real family values and true grace in God. Until then, we have Frank Schaeffer. We will now hear from our guest, followed by a brief discussion, then extensive Q&A from you heathens and hypocrites, with, of course, the few righteous exceptions. Dr. Frank Schaeffer is a best-selling author of fiction and nonfiction and a documentary and feature film director. He is the son of the late evangelist Francis Schaeffer, one of the founders of what we know as the religious right today. Mr. Schaeffer is the author of the nonfiction book, Crazy for God, How I Grew Up as One of the Elect, helped found the religious right, and lived to take all or almost all of it back. And his latest book, just published, is Patience with God, Faith for People Who Don't Like Religion or Atheism. Ladies and gentlemen, Frank Schaeffer.
That's quite an introduction. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm going to say a few words. I apologize that they're going to have to be a little bit biographical to give some context to my remarks and to the later discussion we'll have. I was born and raised in Switzerland as the son of two American parents who came over to Europe in 1947 to work with youth, kids in the bombed-out cities of Europe. My dad was a fundamentalist Presbyterian pastor, a Calvinist. My mom came from missionary stock that goes way back into the China Inland Mission in the 19th century. And my three sisters and I lived in this little religious community called L'Abri Fellowship on mountainside in the French-speaking part of the Swiss Alps. When I was a child, Dad was a very obscure figure, completely unknown, and in fact, a great deal of our energy was spent in praying for funds and the Lord to bring the right kind of people to L'Abri. By right kind of people were those who not only could be helped, but those who would help us and give donations and money. One thing I'd like to say at the outset is my parents were not flakes. Dad never had an office. He worked on the side of his bed in an old rocking chair. Never flew first class even when he became better known. And in many later years, when he became a hero to some of the members of the religious right who tended to fly around in their own private jets and build empires, he was rather shocked and horrified. So my view of religion does not begin with some sort of cynical personal failure on the side of my parents and the mission they had to live up to what they believed was true. It's just I don't believe what they believed was true is true any longer for me. But my objection is not really centered in that part of my childhood, wherein the worst my parents could be accused of was a naivete when it comes to religious views, but not any predatory sense that they would be taking the world back to make it safe for them and them only, or people like them. When I was a teen, L'Abri Fellowship went through a kind of an evolution that followed what was going on in the wider culture, which was the 1960s. One of the first paying jobs I had happened to be working for the Montreux Jazz Festival for a while, doing some of the light show there. And one of the exciting evenings I had, my sort of Letterman-esque brush with fame, was when I was part of the light crew for a Led Zeppelin concert and met Jimmy Page, who I happened to notice had a paperback of one of my dad's books in his back pocket. And Dad, at that point of his life, in a way had become a convert himself, in that he was talking to some very cool people, or people considered cool at the time. For instance, Timothy Leary came out to spend some time in Switzerland talking to Dad, and he knew all sorts of folks. He was carrying on a correspondence with Leopold Senghor, who was the president of Senegal at the time, and also a poet, who would send my dad his poetry. In that manifestation of my father's ministry, at that moment, if somebody had come and looked at the mission of L'Abri from the future, they would probably have seen it more in the light of sort of a Jim Wallace, slightly to the left type of Christianity, certainly interested in culture. There weren't too many evangelicals around giving lectures on the meaning of Bob Dylan's lyrics, for instance. Well, my dad was. Then in 1973, after Roe v. Wade came along, fast forward a little bit into that period of time, I had been painting and wanting to be an artist, going to films of people like Vittorio De Sica and Fellini and others. Dad and I were in the middle of making a series called How Should We Then Live, which was a kind of a poor man's evangelical version of one of those big BBC-type documentaries on art and culture, and wherein everything is explained in 13 episodes or whatever, and you know just what to think about art afterwards. Or maybe nature, if it's one of those things. But we were doing our version, which basically had the thesis that all good art and culture came from 17th century Dutch Reformation Holland. And everything else was either leading to this or downhill afterward. Those secular humanists had ruined things, but nevertheless, it didn't have an edge to it that could have been called political, other than the fact that Dad looked back rather fondly at various theocracies in the series, but it wasn't forward motivated to change politics. And then, in the midst of making this series, Roe v. Wade happened, and as I describe in my book, Crazy for God, both Dad and I took a very hard position on abortion at that point. Me as a young person, just out of my teens, Dad as an older person, but seeing this on a kind of a human rights level, not really political at that time, just shocked at the length to which Roe v. Wade went, for instance, in comparison to most of the abortion rulings, not so much from courts, but policy in Europe, which was more limited in most places. And so we, in the last episodes of that film series, worked in an example of what Dad was calling judicial fiat, and the example he used to prove that point was Roe v. Wade. Well, therein lies a whole story. Because Dad died in 1984, but between 1973, 74, when we were making our film series, and then, Dad and I, as his nepotistic evangelical sidekick for both reasons of greed, access to power, something that was interesting to do, support my family, all of the above, and also genuine, sincere belief, began to become spokesman for what then later was recognized as the religious right. And this began when we met Dr. C. Everett Koop, who was an old family friend going back into the 1940s with my parents, who at that time was Surgeon-in-Chief of Philadelphia Children's Hospital. Soon, on the basis of our film series and a sop to the so-called pro-life movement, would become Surgeon General, came and visited Dad and said, well, it's good you dealt with abortion in these last 2 episodes of your series on art and history and culture. Now you need to make a whole documentary on it. And I have a lot of friends you should meet who will support that and underwrite it. Well, some of those people turned out to be the hated and feared Roman Catholics that I'd grown up my whole life thinking were the whore of Babylon. But now apparently they weren't so much the whore of Babylon, just the slightly fallen woman of Babylon, perhaps. And then later they were good people because they agreed with us. And I remember meeting with Archbishop Fulton Sheen in New York, who was still alive at the time, and kneeling with him at a red velvet altar that he kept in a private chamber in his apartment on Park Avenue. I thought, that's odd. You know, when I was a child, I got punished for imitating Catholics by making a sign of the cross behind my parents' back as we went into Catholic churches just to annoy them. Now I'm kneeling with Fulton Sheen, and he's promising me support from not only the Roman Catholic Church, but the Knights of Columbus and a whole cast of characters, and telling me that Francis Schaeffer, as a respected evangelical leader, which, by the way, no one outside of that little slice of American, well, and international culture would have heard of, but within that culture, very well known, is going to take a stand and get all these people like Billy Graham and others. A name that came up surprisingly at that time was, Billy Graham and pastors, like Oral Robertson and so forth, but then even Jerry Falwell, who would not take a stand on our issue. And unfortunately, as he explained it, it's a Catholic issue. And as I talk about in Crazy for God, he was saying, at last you'll bring your people into this. Well, jump forward a little further, and I'm in Jack and Joanne Kemp's basement a few years later with a finished film series, then on a 16mm projector. This is just before, you could have videotape and all this. Maybe it was just on the cusp of it. But anyway, we projected the film for them. 3 o'clock in the morning, Jack gets up, who later would be Bob Dole's vice president, and he says, this is the issue that will finally get evangelicals to get into politics. You've given us a key. And a couple months later, Dad and I are standing in a forum, not like this, just a big room in the Capitol, and we have about 50 senators and congressmen there, Henry Hyde, Bob Dole, and so forth and so on. Dad's on his way over to the White House to have tea and coffee. Gerald Ford's son, a little before that, was out at L'Abri when we found out his dad had become president. Barbara Bush would visit several times. And parenthetically, my mother, when George Bush Jr. ran the first time, Mom, who at that stage was elderly, she's 95 now, so I'm bad at math, but anyway, she was still old, or not as old, but elderly. She said to me, are you sure it's George Bush? Because Barbara always said that, she asked me to pray for him especially hard because she didn't think he'd amount to anything. So my mom did get that right. But anyway, that's many years later. At that period of time, as you may have noticed, you've got a Crystal Cathedral here in town somewhere, and somebody's son winds up running it until he doesn't, for whatever reason. You have a church with 55,000 members called Saddleback. Eventually, I imagine somebody in that family will be folded in to be led by the Holy Spirit to inherit the mailing list. But nepotism is the order of the day in American big-time Christianity. Billy Graham's son Franklin has taken over there. And I have a story in Patience for God where I talk about how Franklin and his family had this huge fight over where Ruth and Billy are to be buried. Ruth wanted to be buried in a small family plot near their house in Montreat, but Franklin wanted her to be buried in the new Billy Graham amusement park. I'm not being facetious. The Disney Corporation designed and built it for them. So well done, anyone here who works for the Disney Corporation. But the fact of the matter is, she was so bent on being buried where she wanted to be buried that, according to the Washington Post, I wasn't there at the time, although I knew Ruth since I was a child, she had 6 witnesses in a notarized document saying where she wanted to be buried. Nevertheless, her mortal remains rest at the Billy Graham Center, where visitors can go and see the life of Billy Graham, and there's already a place next to her for Billy, so they've actually sort of built themselves, strange for Protestants, a Roman Catholic repository for saints. But again, you can always sign up for the mailing list on the way in and out. But that's a digression. My dad died in '84, and the 2 years before he died, he had cancer, was being treated at the Mayo Clinic, and I was often his surrogate, in that I would be sent out to speak and fill in for him when he wasn't well, places like the Southern Baptist Convention, looking out over 24,000 Southern Baptist pastors in Dallas one year. This was the 70s, the late 70s or the early 80s, so it was a sea of pale blue polyester as far as the eye could see. And I was the keynote speaker at the National Religious Broadcasters and on and on and on. And then I started getting a lot of invitations in my own right. Pat Robertson offered me a television program. James Dobson gave away 150,000 copies of a special edition of some right-wing screed I had written, which, by the way, Karen Armstrong quotes in her book on fundamentalism as the most typical of all comments from the fundamentalists in terms of a summation of everything that's wrong with that point of view. But, and I have to confess, for the last couple of years of this charade, which is what it was, I was both heartsick at being involved, as the whole thing turned ugly and nasty, increasingly so, and politicized, felt like a fraud because I had long since given up belief in the doctrine as accepted and received by folks who were agreeing with my parents. And as I said to my wife one day, if our side ever wins, the first person they'll put up against a wall and shoot is me, just on the basis of the movies I like and the people I like to hang around with and so forth. But after my dad died and I began to get offers to inherit his mantle, as it were, and by the way, I've never earned more money, and I'm not talking about inflated adjusted dollars, I mean literally, let alone inflated adjusted dollars, as I did in those 2 or 3 years toward the end there. Really big honorariums and all sorts of perks and book royalties that I could only dream about now that I'm in an actual publishing world, rather than selling books to followers. But I was actually turning into more and more of a real son of a bitch at home. My wife was very unhappy. I was very unhappy. My kids were not happy. I'd come off the road just absolutely bubbling over, because it's difficult if you have a moderate intelligence and any integrity at all to be hock deep in a kind of la-la land of cretinism, which is where we were. And even when I got out back in '85, sort of completely, already it had shifted from being about pro-life to being anti-gay. The seeds of the whole anti-immigrant movement were there. And it was dawning on me, and I'll wrap it up with this, that I had stumbled into really a life from hell, in that I was just following in my dad's footsteps into the part of his life that was a terrible mistake on his part. He should have stuck with talking to Jimmy Page and people. And that the political side of what we were doing really had the beginnings, and I know this is an overused word, but it was closer to a beer hall putsch than it was to anything even vaguely American in terms of the better parts of our history. And so I began to have a real crisis, not only of conscience, but of faith. So to round a long story up, in 1990, after I had left this movement in the mid-'80s and made 4 really crappy Hollywood films, and if any of you worked on any of those movies, I apologize for wasting your time. What was one? Rebel Storm, Headhunter, Baby on Board, with Judge Reinhold and Carol Kane, which I made for ABC in Canada, and Wired to Kill. All movies you can catch if you are an insomniac, maybe once a year somewhere when they run out of everything else on a telethon. But anyway, I had certainly not found my career. But my wife said, well, why don't you write? You're not a bad writer, and you like telling the children stories about growing up. And so I wrote a novel called Portofino, which got a good break here in this town when Richard Eder was doing reviews for the LA Times. He gave me full half-page, 6 columns across, hailed it as a great book. And I got permission to keep writing for a very different audience. My audience didn't like my stuff because they're works of humor about growing up religious. They felt I had betrayed them. But the betrayal had only begun, because after writing fiction for a few years, Portofino, Zermatt, Saving Grandma, most recently Baby Jack, then I wrote this memoir, Crazy for God, in which I really laid out the journey of a little boy growing up in an idealistic communal setting, all about Jesus, and how you wind up going from that to basically being on the side of the kind of people who would kick gay people to death if they could get away with it, and right now, tonight, are selling bumper stickers quoting one of the Psalms, asking God to kill the leader. And the path between that and where I wound up is told in Crazy for God. And then the response to that book, I wrote Patience with God, because I found that the polarization that I had helped create, along with Dad and many, many others, had been answered by the new Atheist Movement. And in Hitchens and Dawkins and a number of others, I see the same tone and voice that we were adopting. I have nothing against atheism, by the way. Not speaking, not euphemistically, but, some of my best friends are atheists, and in my case are actually literal. Some of my best friends are atheists, and in fact, I am often an atheist, because I'm a person of faith, but I'm a person of faith, not certainty. There's a difference. And so faith means that some days you're an atheist, some days you're an agnostic, some days you'd rather just be French. And then at other times, you hark back to your childhood belief and you say, I don't believe anything because I think it's true. It's just I was conditioned by my parents. And then other days, you sense something genuine about spirituality, and you have that sense that maybe there is more out there to life than the sum of our parts, and so forth. But it's a journey that I talk about in Patience with God. And the fact that I think we've been given a very bad choice by people like me in my former life, between this absolutist certainty of fundamentalism and then on the other side, the reaction, the Dawkins and Hitchens type reaction and marketing of an atheism that really is just a reaction to a reaction. And I think there's a better path that can leave atheism, agnosticism, faith, all these things intact, but actually turn the discussion into an actual conversation and change the tone there. So that's what the new book does. And with that, that's my 18 minutes of fame, not 15. I went a little over, and then we go to the next part of the program, so thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Frank, for taking us on your journey there. Let's start with the premise. Well, let me ask you, do you think the Republican Party has been taken over by Limbaughs and the Palins and who, I don't know, there's one guy, one evangelical in the mix there, Huckabee, but I don't think he's a real player. Give us a sense of, I take it you were Republican, at least that's who you communed with.
I was.
Right.
But as someone pointed out, you can't say I was a lifelong Republican unless you died, and this is now an incarnation of someone else. But up until I changed, I was a lifelong Republican. But I re-registered as an independent voter and have been since. But although as recently as 2000, I worked for John McCain to try to get him elected instead of George W. Bush, one of the reasons being at that time it happened that my youngest son was in the United States Marine Corps, and I didn't fancy this commander-in-chief, and I think 4,000 plus deaths later, 50,000 wounded and hundreds of thousands of dead Iraqis, that hunch proved right. And too bad that McCain, actually, to answer your question, is really the metaphor for the whole thing. I mean, a few years before, he was calling the folks that I was hanging around with agents of intolerance. A couple years later, he has to nominate one of their worst examples in order to get the blessing of people like James Dobson, who up till then said they wouldn't vote for him, and his advisors, who I knew, by the way. McCain wrote a lovely foreword to one of my books on what it was like to be a military parent, and was on friendly terms with these guys. We're saying, you know, we don't have a shot unless we get the evangelicals on board. They are our power. They are the groups that kept electing President Bush. They're the difference between winning and losing. We have no choice. So at that point, you know, I'd already been done. And where the line sort of, why I re-registered was that, you know, what was done to McCain in terms of the Swift boating with this nonsense about him having an illegitimate black child, which was crazy on many fronts, one of which being this was an adopted young woman from Asia, that Pat Robertson and you know, the Bush people and all these guys were putting him out, along with Jerry Falwell and so forth. I had just had it. So I had already been secretly voting for Democrats before that. But at that point, it was just, this is insane. This is crazy. It's all gone. And I would just say that it really is, and that there actually is not a Republican Party now. There is a religious cult called the religious right on one hand, and a cult of war called neoconservatism on the other hand. And together they have basically destroyed not just the Republican Party, but may actually be the handwriting on the wall, without being alarmist, and I don't believe this will happen, I said may, of democracy for a while, because, you know, no matter how much you like Democrats or Barack Obama, one-party state is not really good. And when you have one real political party, which is the Democrats, faced by an insurrection that is essentially claiming your president is not an American and or the Antichrist, literally, or putting bumper stickers around quoting a psalm calling for God to kill him, and or saying that if we have health care reform, while torture should be legal, in their view. Healthcare reform should not, in addition to which healthcare reform will lead to death panels, wherein they borrow from the language my dad and I invented for the Protestant pro-life movement. I think you've come pretty near the end of the road. And Sarah Palin is the symptom, not the cause. And all I can say is William F. Buckley, Jack Kemp, these guys, they were friends of our family. William F. Buckley used to come to my dad's house in Switzerland because he had a chalet over in Gstaad, and we were up in Chesières. It was, again, you know, like I say, some of my friends are atheists. You know, Gore Vidal was a genuine friend of Bill's, and they would go out and have drinks after he'd debate him on firing line. And they would debate as equal people of intelligence and integrity, kindness. Whatever you thought of Bill Buckley or anything else, you know, Sarah Palin and Bill Buckley are not cut from the same cloth. And, you know, Bill could tie his own shoes and everything, you know, so.
Well, let me ask you then, there are two possible scenarios here about the demise or the fate of the Republican Party. One is that they'll tap out with the religious right, which will never be more than 30% of the electorate, and so they'll therefore self-marginalize. Or the other scenario is that we'll have what we have here in California, which is an incredible political dysfunction, because the minority, this hardcore minority of Republicans have managed to hold entire state hostage, along with Republican governors, even though this is a Democratic state. They've actually been in power mostly, and they've got most of their agenda, and they've obstructed every other bit of the Democrats' agenda. So we have a real paralysis, and we're facing bankruptcy. So which of those two scenarios, or is there a third, which people are overlooking, and that is that maybe Sarah Palin and company aren't tapped out. Maybe they will, as the economy turns sour, and you mentioned the beer hall push earlier, maybe they'll find more and more recruits and eventually become a majority.
Well, if you look at what Palinism has become, she has an exact equivalent, and her name was Evita Peron. Sarah Palin's nothing to do with American politics.
Well, who's Peron, though? Who's
Rupert Murdoch, who without whom none of these people would be anything. I mean, he took American citizenship to buy TV stations, and I don't know what his agenda is, but I know one thing for sure. He ain't no born-again Christian. You know, he ain't doing this for Jesus. He may be doing it for the bottom line, but the difference between a Glenn Beck in his natural state, which would be standing on a lonely street corner barking at the moon, and Glenn Beck as we know him as a threat to national security, making veiled threats against the president, is the many billion-dollar empire that gives him the big megaphone. And so there are people involved now, you know, with paying folks like Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh and all these other people, Hannity and the rest, who give them an amplification that, for instance, Father Coughlin never had in the 30s. He had his own little nasty radio station, and he could rail and rant, and he could get people out in the street, but he wasn't given a news channel, and he wasn't given an entire subculture that had been built for 30 years by people like me and Pat Robertson and others. And so we're in a kind of a different position. Now, I have a lot of faith in the United States. I have a lot of faith in our democracy, and I think given the natural course of events, and I say natural course of events, you know, I wouldn't say this will have a happy ending, but these people aren't going to succeed. But I do think that, and I'll say it, and it's the thing nobody wants to say, I think that the threat of assassination hangs in the air like a bad dream. And of course, as we all know, it's a stupid phrase, but Game Changer hardly covers it. And the thing that really makes me, I don't know the word even, you know, outrage doesn't cover it, but anyway, I'll leave it at that, is that we're in a position now where the opposition to Barack Obama, racism aside, basically to them, all good news about America is bad news. So you get a crowd of people who wanted to kill us a couple of years ago, giving him a standing ovation at Cairo University, that's bad. You have him showing proper respect to a Chinese politician. He bows, as the custom in China. That's showing America bowing, and we don't bow to anybody. We just bully and kill them. That's our proper posture, is with our foot on the neck of everyone. And so we have a group of people in this country that are so driven by reaction against them And that circle of they has now increased. It went from abortion providers to all gay men and women. Now it's gone from illegal immigrants to just about anybody who looks different than you do. Sarah Palin's most frightening phrase is not some of her silly things she said, but it's the one that so many of these folks like Ann Coulter have mirrored in other ways, and that is there are real Americans, and then there's everybody else. And of course, you know, I'm not even going to draw the parallels. You all know where they go. But this is really bad news, I think, for this country. So I don't see these people ever winning politically in the normal course of events. But I see them creating a level of chaos, which is really dangerous. And one little footnote, I've got to add this somewhere tonight because I came in here saying there's one thing I want to say, this will be it. So now I'm going to say it even if it's out of context. That's why I find it lamentable when I hear so many people on the left acting as if this luxury we have in President Obama can be taken for granted, and that if you don't like his timetable of change, all of a sudden, oh, he's failed. He's had a whole year to resolve 30 years of Republican, evangelical, right-wing dominance of our political system. Why isn't it all better? And I'm really, frankly, and this has nothing to do with it, but I personally find that very disappointing and sickening, actually. Really sickening, with friends like these, you know. And when you think of what he's up against, and the physical courage, not just the physical courage it takes for a black man to stand up and be president of this country, just one thing, you know, to emphasize that. Boston Globe had an article a couple of weeks ago saying that the threat level has gone up 400% that the Secret Service is dealing with, above all other presidencies. And that their budget's so stretched that they're trying to look at how they can either get new agents, increase the budget, or do less in things like their counterfeit tracing and all this stuff, because they are so overloaded just chasing down threats they know about. 400%, that's an enormous increase. And so in that climate, and in a climate where for the first time we have a country speaking of multilateral action instead of unilateral, for the first time in my memory, we have a president taking not just global warming seriously, but a hate crimes bill, and saying that gays should be able to serve openly in the military, maybe not exactly on the timetable everybody wanted, but that's his belief, and he's willing to say it, and just be an African-American president with a progressive leaning. The courage that takes, you know, to me is the most inspiring thing I've seen in my lifetime. So I think we would all do well to say, well, you know, what are the alternatives here? And not just within the Democratic Party. I mean, two lines are forming. You know, Sarah Palin and Rush Limbaugh are sitting up in one place, and Michelle and Barack Obama at the other line. And I just think right now it's time for everybody who has a vision of what's at stake to get behind this president and fight like hell to help him succeed. That doesn't mean you don't have different ideas, but it certainly means that this smart-ass sniping all the time is just ridiculous. That's what I think.
In your talk, Frank, you gave us a sort of sketch of the genesis of the religious right and how they accrued power and what provoked them. Roe v. Wade, and now we understand how they've been successful. But some of the tools that they've used are for the long term. It's not just, in other words, they have been quite judicious and quite strategic about building their political power, and they've laid foundations for future power. And one of those, of course, is the C Street group that organizes evangelicals on the Hill in the House and the Senate and gives them safe harbor, and you know they counseled the governor of South Carolina's problems with his long-distance lover, and they have apparently spread out, and they've talked to foreign leaders, they talk to diplomats, they talk to people in the bureaucracy. They've got quite a network, which we're not quite sure about the extent of it. We also have the Patrick Henry School, and we have the Messiah College, and we found out during the Gonzales period when he was Attorney General that Karl Rove dealt with a woman who had a very senior position in the Justice Department, who was actually picking and choosing U.S. attorneys, And she was a graduate of Messiah College, so not, in other words, not one of the best
Sure.
and brightest, which was the tradition in the Justice Department. So I don't see anything happening, not so much on the left, but even in the center. I don't know any other group in America that is planning a sort of training cadres to take over not just electoral office, but within the bureaucracies and getting permanent status in civil servants.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think what people have to understand about the political right is that it's actually divided into two parts. There's foot soldiers who are running around at town hall meetings screaming at elected officials, breaking the meetings up, sort of playing the part of stormtroopers. And then there's, of course, people like Karl Rove and so forth who are anything but stupid, who plan for the long term. But there's a third element that I'd like to touch on that maybe is a bit different, and that is one of the things that makes this whole group so unreachable by politics, as most of us in this room perhaps would understand it, is that argument and logic have nothing to do with any of this, because they have been literally weaned from their early childhood by everything from the homeschool and also the Christian evangelical school movement to treat facts themselves as suspicious and subversive. So the very fact that you have a fact that has a source other than their subculture makes it out of bounds. Now, usually when you have an argument with someone, you argue about an interpretation of something you both agree exists. Let's say that we're all sitting here tonight, okay? But if half the people in this room believe that they are on another planet right now, and that if you challenge that, that itself is an affront to them, you have a problem. And so when you look at the Republican power structure, one of the things that they have done is they have people like Karl Rove who know what they're doing, and a Dick Cheney, who are not fools. Then you have, and Dick Armey, for instance, who employs these foot soldiers for his lobbying group to try to torpedo the healthcare reform. Then you have the foot soldiers themselves, most of which are white, middle and lower middle class, uneducated, and or educated but deliberately as an act of faith, rejecting facts, be it the age of the earth or anything else. But then you have another group that have, I think, snapped and actually believe their own bullshit. Mm-hmm. And they are not only unreachable, but it is from their ranks that we really have to fear the result of a gun culture combined with people who have an agenda which is not written on this planet. Just take one example, the Christian Zionist movement with people like Hagee, who really are rooting for Armageddon and who are instinctively against the Middle East peace process because it'll screw up the end of time. And what they really want is all-out war in the Middle East. And the bigger and the sooner, the better. So when you combine that with sort of the neoconservative knee-jerk war everywhere all the time is a good thing, you have some smart people on one side manipulating people who you could say are either stupid or crazy, but who are looking not through a lens where we could all agree on a basic premise and then discuss the result or how to get there. But these folks in their heads are not even citizens of the United States. They are in a different place. And one of the things I do in Patience with God is take a whole chapter to just dissect the pathology, if you like, of the whole Left Behind book series and why it has been so successful. And I think I pretty well nailed it. And the reason I took the time to do this is I think that people who still are living on planet Earth have to understand that, like some bad 50s horror movie, we have aliens amongst us, and these are the lizard people. So you have to be very, very careful. Because they're different than most folks. And yeah, okay, I'm being facetious, but nevertheless, the truth of the matter is, I don't think a lot of people who are friends of mine, these atheist friends I keep talking about, actually get it, because they themselves can't understand that this is serious business to these guys, and that when you have 60 million copies of a Left Behind series floating around, and the game that goes with it, the video game that goes with it, is a publicly traded company. It isn't all happening because this is light entertainment. It's feeding an agenda which is really antithetical, not just, talking about hyperbole here, not just to the future of the United States, but to civilization itself, because it's betting against it. So this is the Khmer Rouge. This is just scorched earth. And they're rooting for that. And you can dress it up any way you like, but that's why I wrote a chapter about this in Patience with God. Because it's serious, and people have to understand this, and it has to just be stood against, and I think has to be stood up against, and not, oh, well, we respect this because it's dressed in the garb of religion, and so we'll just, we can't judge this because it's religion. I think it has to be judged and denounced and put beyond the pale, so that, when a John McCain goes down to get somebody like Haggie's blessing, that should have been the end of his campaign if anybody understood who Haggie was. I mean, this is ridiculous. It's just crazy.
Now, just to add gasoline to this fire that you're breathing here.
I know where the exits are behind there.
We had Mikey Weinstein here some time back at the Hammer Forum.
Right.
And, he formed this Military Religious Freedom Foundation.
Sure.
And he got into it because they were proselytizing his sons at the Air Force Academy and making them watch Mel Gibson's movie. That got him into this thing. And he's got all kinds of people inside the military,
Right.
coming to him anonymously, and particularly now since this shooting down at Fort Hood, a lot of Muslims in the military. They're finding a safe harbor. And apparently most of the people who are the victims of religious intolerance inside the military are Christians who are being proselytized by fundamentalists, many of whom are their officers, which
Right.
put them in an awful situation. But without getting too dramatic and Hollywood and paranoid, if you got a group of people inside the United States military who share the kind of agenda that you just talked about and have the same mindset, they've got nuclear weapons, for God's sake.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when you get into this territory, it's you don't want to be quoted, so forget all this part. But again, it doesn't take too many people. We just saw this down at Fort Hood, where the guy can buy a handgun that should be illegal, firing cop killer ammunition, Teflon-coated high-powered ammunition that should be illegal. So you have a country the NRA has contributed their bit. They did it, they've contributed this. Then you have a climate in which there's a hands-off view of religion, so nobody can ask anybody what they believe because that would be un-American. So he could be stark staring crazy and ready to start his own little jihad, or just one more psychiatrist over the edge. We'll never know. But nobody's asking questions because there's a sort of an indelicate, there's a sort of a political correctness both where the left and the right come together on this. We can't question this guy. This is religion. He can believe anything he wants. Yeah, but can you believe anything you want and swear to uphold the U.S. Constitution? Because you better believe that more than this other stuff you believe. And that's something we don't like asking. So the same lens has to be turned on people from other faiths as has been turned and continues to be turned on the Muslim community since 9/11. You can't have.
So in other words,
an
we should be
uneven
looking
standard
at the
on this.
Christo-fascists as much as the purported Islamo-fascists.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you have people, I'll just give you this. There's this bumper sticker. Tonight I was on a television program making a commentary here, so if anybody sees me close up and I have makeup, I'm not really crazy, okay? I don't.
You're just
and
in
I
Hollywood,
don't mind
right?
being
Yeah.
my age. I just ran over here from the other place.
That was with Rachel Maddow, right?
Yes, and we were talking about that. But she was asking me about this bumper sticker that's being widely circulated, quoting this psalm in which it calls for the death of the ruler.
What is the actual quotation?
I don't know. I don't have it memorized. My mother never did teach me enough. So it's, I think, Psalm 9. No, I'm not going to say. Anyway, you'll see. I should have made a note of it. But the quotation is basically saying, will God hasten the demise of the unjust ruler or whatever, and it's essentially just saying, God should kill Obama.
God smite Obama.
Yeah, God smite Obama. So the point being, if somebody in a big beard who looked like Osama bin Laden had a bumper sticker on his car with a verse from the Quran calling for the death of the president, somebody would ask him a question or two. But, you can be a white Christian and nobody is going to ask you anything. And I saw this most vividly in another context when Jeremiah Wright was being pilloried as a traitor for saying, "God damn America," when my dad said exactly the same sort of things. In fact, in my father's last book, called A Christian Manifesto, said that if abortion couldn't be resolved peacefully, it was time to overthrow the U.S. government, and his reward was to get invited back to the White House again for another lunch. So, if it's in the mouth of a white American preacher from the right, he's a prophet. If it's in the mouth of a black preacher from Chicago, he's a traitor. And I think the same thing happens here. So I wouldn't cut any slack to Muslims in the U.S. military, but I don't think we should cut the Christians any slack either. I think we shouldn't cut religion any more slack than you would cut anybody else in any walk of life who is supposed to be upholding the Constitution, whether that's a judge or a politician. The separation of church and state is real, and it's the saving grace of this country as far as I can see, even when it's religion you like. And so I think one of the things that's really happened here is that we've gotten hoisted on our own petard because this aspect of political correctness, you can't criticize me, that's my personal religious belief, has come around and really bit us from the left and the right, and everybody's tongue-tied. I don't think so. No more free lunch for religion. I think that religion should be held to the same standard when it comes to trying to balance religious views, quote-unquote personal views, and your ability to do a certain job, like carry a loaded firearm somewhere. These things have got to be looked at. And so, as far as I'm concerned, the shooting at Fort Hood is not a wake-up call that tells me that we've got to look harder at Muslims in the military, which we may well have to. But it's a wake-up call that this romantic, crazy notion that as long as you say, it's my personal religious belief, that it just throws a big screen over the whole thing and no one has a right to question it. That has to go. That's what I think.
Let's open up to questions here from the audience. We have we have microphones on both sides. Where are our Phil Donahue's here? Here they are. Okay, that lady there in front of you, on the right. Yes.
Hello?
Yes,
Ladies
the
and
lady
gentlemen.
right in front of you.
Oh,
Yeah.
perfect.
Good evening. So you were saying that the religious right has been planning for a very long time to take over the power the way that they have and the party. So how would you conceive of a plan for freedom and liberty and respect of human rights when that's inherently not a group activity? Right. And in the way that the agenda of the religious right is, it's strengthened by the large group that follows.
Well, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but right now his name is Barack Obama, who happens to be, like it or not, speaking of personal faith, an evangelical Christian who had a very real salvation, quote-unquote, experience when he was a community organizer and has never gainsaid that. But this is a sane man who understands his job is to be president of the United States, not to bring the kingdom of God on earth, and he's giving real programs to do that, or trying to. So the strange thing is that in him we have the exact opposite of George Bush, not just policy-wise, but in their interpretation of religion. Because Barack Obama gave a talk on what he thought was the proper balance between church and state 2.5 years before he ran for president, under the auspices of the Sojourners and Jim Wallace. And in that talk, he laid out exactly how he thinks the balance should be. And it's one of the best things I've heard on that from a person who also purports to be religious. He could have given the same talk, by the way, had he been an atheist. And that is that, which comes first, the cart and the horse, and which hat are you wearing, and it makes a difference to how you function, and so forth. And so, the weird thing is that in Barack Obama we have proof that you can be somebody religious and be sane, and not wear your religion on your sleeve, and understand you're president of the United States. and occasionally have a misstep in that direction by being too accommodating, by having, say, a Rick Warren do his thing and offend people who have voted for you. But nevertheless, I don't think anybody, even the harshest critic of Barack Obama, is going to think that he's trying to establish a theocracy right now. And so these things can coexist. And I think that that's the American tradition. We have founding fathers who were Bible-believing Christians like my father, others who were deists, others who were atheists, others who were agnostics. You read the poetry of Anne Bradstreet and see what was happening in the Bay State Colony. And she was more interested in her writing than in proselytizing. You go down to Virginia, and it's just a bunch of businessmen using the slave trade to get rich. We've been this mixture from the beginning. So the vision is, I think, to first of all, tell the truth to children, tell the truth to ourselves about what this country is. And then I think we have to have a tough critique of the part religion is starting to play in our society. And really be honest about it and stop dancing around it and just say, these people are not just dangerous to the Democratic Party, they're dangerous to the Republic, because this is never what America was. And they're taking us in a direction that if they had their way with these Reconstructionists and these other people, would destroy our country. And this is not, and as I say, being given legs by all the money. I think there's a little illustration here that's happening right now as we speak. I don't think Sarah Palin is that important, and I don't think her book means anything, but there's a good little story here with it. The person who ghost wrote Sarah Palin's book is one of the editors at World Magazine, which is a far-right reactionary magazine established by a guy called Olasky, who was somebody I knew years back and was someone who knew my father, who's a Christian Reconstructionist, wants to bring America back, not back because it never was there, but make this a theocracy is what it would amount to. Her book is being printed and sold by Zondervan, that used to be a mom and pop evangelical group, little publishing company back in the day. We helped them get going, and now is owned by Rupert Murdoch. They made the millions of dollars to pay her $5 million advance off the hundreds of millions of dollars they made off A Purpose-Driven Life. And the book is being given legs by the Fox News Corp and all their mouthpieces. So there you see the whole picture here. It's commerce and untrammeled greed on one side. It's far-right politics, but you've got people mixed in who really think America should be a theocracy, and a ghostwriter who thinks gay people will burn in hell, and that Roosevelt was a secret communist, which this ghostwriter wrote. There's the picture for you. And this is projected as the sort of mainstream, quote-unquote, alternative to Barack Obama and a democratically controlled Congress. So when going back to your question about what do I think happened to the Republican Party, this isn't the Republican Party. This is something completely different. I don't know what it is. I can't give it an exact name, but it's not a political party. It's something else.
Do you think, though, that, just to answer that question, do you think that there's a way that, for the want of a better description, secular humanists could form their own C Street, their own Patrick Henry, train cadres to get into government? I mean, is that just not the nature of the beast?
No, I think it is, but I think that it's called the Democratic Party, and people have got to just work like hell to get progressive Democrats elected until this either goes away or fails so miserably, hopefully not because of an assassination that gives it a bad reputation, but just fades away.
This gentleman down here on the fifth row.
I was at Max Blumenthal meeting in Riverside, and a bunch of drunk kids disturbed the meeting, and the cops show up because they... But one leader, especially one young man, looks like a military guy. What do you think about that? That they organize those, disturbing the meetings?
Well, the people disturbing the meetings would not be the U.S. military. You might have somebody in the military who's part of a group like that. But, I can just say that some of the people I know who are most horrified, for instance, about the direction that George Bush took us in, because I wrote some successful books. I had one as a bestseller after Oprah talked to me briefly about it, about my experience of being a military parent. just to disabuse anybody, not you, but anybody who thinks this, don't bring the 60s vision of U.S. military forward here. The people I know who disliked George Bush the most were Marine generals who thought he was an idiot and told me so. But because they can't get up and make public statements while in uniform until they retire, they weren't saying it. Barack Obama has some very wide and broad support in the U.S. military at all ranks. I'm not saying the majority, but this idea that somehow the military is from the right, with this sort of a post-60s vision of it, is not the case, in my experience. And I've talked to a lot of folks in the military because of some of the books I've written. There's a lot of people in the military who are very disturbed by the level of targeting that evangelical groups like Campus Crusade are doing to try to invade the chaplaincy and weight it with fundamentalist chaplains all through the military for two reasons. They want to convert more people in the military to Christ, and they also want to position them as missionaries in Muslim countries. So this isn't the U.S. military. This is people who are looking at the military as a target to get into and change the dynamic. So, you know, I think the military itself is at risk of this, and so this young man might have been one of those people, or he might not have been. And I know Max has sort of been followed around by a bunch of people who turn out who are a bit thuggish and try to disturb his meetings because he's, I think, told the truth about a lot of aspects of this question.
This gentleman here in the blue shirt in the fifth row. Wait for the mic. Yeah.
Bringing this discussion perhaps back to religion, what happened to religion in the United States that's conceived of as something that's private, spiritual, is involved in good deeds and helping people who need help and are less able and or just have bad luck? What happened? Could you sort of sketch the history of that aspect of religion, especially the private aspect of it?
Well, yeah, I can. One of the things that I do in my book, Patience with God, is I try to trace something that I think a lot of people on all sides of this debate have forgotten. For instance, Bill Maher forgot it when he made Religulous. And that is, there is a whole thread that runs through all religions, including Christianity, which could be described as not only humanist, but mystical and absolutely antithetical to a rationalist, doctrinal approach to faith. So if you start from the position that life is short and no one knows anything, and you were probably wrong about that, you come up with something called apophatic theology, which is the theology of unknowing, where all you can talk about is what you don't know about God, if there is a God, because no one could know this. When you switch and you actually become the Protestant religious version of Enlightenment rationalism, then you create something called American evangelicalism, which boils faith down not to who you are and the content of your character, but belief in correct doctrine. So you're a member of the party if you sign on to whatever it is, the born-again statement plus this theology. And the minute you shift from character formation through a journey, which some might call spirituality and others just call life, and make it correct belief, then those who don't believe correctly are your enemy, because they're trying to undermine your faith. So the thread that is not anti-rational, but regards spirituality as undescribable fundamentally by its very nature, because it's this feeling that we human beings are more than the sum of our describable parts, just a sense that we may be, which is something I share, for instance, results in a totally different look at religion than when you are going by, here are the 7 things you must always believe, here are the 7 things you must never believe, and you will be judged eternally based on correct belief, which also means you have to always be sincere. Since you can't be, because we all have mixed motives about everything all the time, you've got to constantly rev yourself up. And what better way to rev yourself up than by describing and vilifying and finally shutting out your enemies? And so faith comes down to correct ideas rather than behavior. So if you look at the bits of the Bible that I like, And by the way, even fundamentalists pick and choose, or they'd be stoning people who didn't go to their marriage bed as virgins. So all this business about we believe all of it is nonsense. None of them believe all of it. They'd all be in jail. They pick and choose. So those of us who, for instance, are still following in the Christian tradition, as I would, in this sense, pick and choose, and we look at examples, not just in Scripture, but in history or around us, or in my book, Patience with God, I talk about a teacher I had when I was 11, a stonemason who worked in my village, things I learned from these people. And we don't look at them to get the right idea so you can be saved by belief. You look at them as the kind of people you'd like to be treated by as a human being. And you try to become more like them. Why? Because you're sick of being a jerk to your wife and a bad father and a bad neighbor, and you'd rather be someone you find admirable. And so you look for people to imitate, not their words or what they taught, as in, here's the doctrine of the Trinity, here's the doctrine of born again, here's the doctrine of the person of Jesus, but rather taught by the kind of people they are. And that's a totally different kind of a thing. And that has a completely different result. Now, of course, there's not one clean thread and one clean thread here. There's always a mixture, even within people's hearts, as it were. But the problem with the atheist religion debate today is that when you look at, for instance, Hitchens' approach, you wouldn't know this thread ever existed. And when you look at, Bill Maher's Religulous, you'd never know that. On the other hand, when you look at American fundamentalism, it's so uneducated about its own historical root that it believes that somehow everybody was a fundamentalist from the beginning, and all this other stuff is modern liberalism, not realizing that if a 4th century mystic like Evagrius the Solitary wandered into their midst, they would immediately fire him from their seminaries as a heretic because he didn't believe anything they believe. And he said, you can't know any of this anyway. Moreover, if you judge someone else as wrong, then that's proof you're lost. See, they wouldn't buy any of that. They'd say, oh, he must have come from Berkeley. But he wasn't. He was sitting around in a cave thinking thoughts like this. And, if Bill Maher had ever run into him, all this guy would have done is serve him tea, smile, and say, well, I'll think about what you've said for another 20 years and come back and talk to me. But it wasn't this in-your-face trying to convince you of anything, because when your basic premise is a sort of a humility of uncertainty, you're not proselytizing. You're just trying to be a more decent human being. It leads to a whole different set of results.
But can we get away from wearing religion on a sleeve, which is what the question you want to know? Can we get back to a more private religion as opposed to, literally wearing religion on your sleeve?
Yeah, I think we can, because it still exists in the world. Some people haven't forgotten it completely, and I'll give you a personal example. When I first got interested in the Greek Orthodox Church, I went off on a pilgrimage to a couple of places, and one of them was talking to an old bishop in Jerusalem, who was totally out of favor, by the way, with the powers that be, because he was too decent a guy to play the politics. And I said to him, in all sincerity, having talked to him and found him so admirable and wise in so many things, you live this chaste celibate life, and you eat sort of one hazelnut a year, and and do all this stuff and so forth and so on, and you're a wonderful person. How can I ever get there? And at the time, in my sort of Protestant, give me the program, I didn't understand his answer, but actually thinking back on it, it was the best answer he could have given, and really it sort of sums everything up. And he looked at me in all sincerity, and he said, be kind to your wife. And that was it. I mean, I went all the way to the top of the mountain. But coming from him, it made me really think. And he summed up his whole spiritual life. I said, well, I live in the world, and I'm trying to do this, and writing, and movies, and all this. How can I ever find this? And he said, of course you can find it. Be kind to your wife. Now, that was Bishop Nikiforos. If the world of religion was him, we'd be having a whole different talk here tonight, and nobody would be putting bumper stickers on their car calling for the death of the president.
Question in front here.
Yeah, I wanted to bring together a few different strands here. The idea of, this personal religion, also race and religion. So on the aspect of race, the idea that Obama's a racist because he's racist against whites, which, in the United States of America, racist against whites, I don't understand that concept. And then, the idea that, the idea of syncretic religions, if you will, the religion of slaves, the idea that there are three important elements: the idea of community, the idea of social justice, and ecstatic practices. How do we understand that kind of today, that intersection?
Well, it's a long way from where the discussion is today. So you have to decide what kind of religion you're going to begin to look at. Again, if you want to take the surface gloss and find the stupidest people, you make religulous. If you want to create what amounts to a nascent American fascism, you take the harshest element of the idea of a theocracy and you apply it, round peg through a square hole to American history. If you want to look at what religion has actually been and said, it's never been any different discussion than everybody's always had everywhere, which is a very simple principle. And that is, we were single-celled organisms a couple seconds ago, geologically speaking. We evolved as very vicious, nasty primates, and we're only one step away from that. And so Hitchens is wrong. It isn't religion's fault. And Dobson is wrong. Jesus won't solve it. The only thing that will solve this is a moral and ethical evolution to go along with a physical evolution. And that's an evolution we have to choose and shape. And so, there may have been wars of religion, but does anybody seriously think that religion, if it had not developed as part of human history, that there would have been no wars? Was the problem of the Gulag communism, or was it that Stalin was a human being, cut in the same frame of mind as a very religious person called Oliver Cromwell? They came at things very differently, but the problem, I think, is the human condition. And the real discussion is to take those parts of religion, not because they're religious, but because they're part of human evolution, and apply them to our condition. And take the parts of science and apply them to our human condition. Scientists have to pick and choose too. Science has created global warming and the atom bomb. And so science without any moral direction is no better than religion with nothing but judgmental direction. There has to be a moral element here, and you can call it anything you want. So the new atheist movement that simply says if we laugh all religion into oblivion and discuss it as a ridiculous thing of the past, I'm not sure they're doing anybody a favor by taking anything off the table that might be a tool to get anyone to be decent, no matter what the motivation is. And I reverse that, and that is religious people who say, well, if you have correct ideas, you'll behave better. Really? We haven't seen anything of it yet. So me personally, where I end patience with God is I tell this story about Christ and the woman taken in adultery. His solution was break the Old Testament law, don't stone her to death, and look inward and decide whether you're pure enough to judge anybody. And that's not such a bad place to begin all these discussions, whoever you believe Jesus was or wasn't. That's not the point.
Yes, the gentleman behind you up there now.
Yes, two quick questions. We all know that it was Roe versus Wade and the gay rights movement that got the fundamentalist religious right off the reservation. But how did they transform the Republican Party of Gerald Ford and Nelson Rockefeller and Barry Goldwater and Jacob Javits, of very well-educated, openly pro-choice and pro-gay moderates, to Sarah Palin and Mike Huckabee? And secondly, what do you think of liberal, some would call them religious left spokespeople like John Spong, who say we need to sack any priest or rabbi or minister who teaches a literal heaven or a resurrection or a belief in God as hopelessly uneducated, just like Hitchens does, and we need to emphasize Jewish and Christian culture more than anything else?
Yeah, remind me of the second part if I forget. I won't. It was a good question, but my brain only does one question at a time. The answer to the first question, I'm afraid, is really sobering, because it applies to our area of thinking tonight, as everybody laughs and scoffs at Sarah Palin and these people. Guess why it was taken over? Because educated, sane, urbane, rational people didn't take these guys seriously. They thought they could use them and not be used. And guess what? You know, the tail's wagging the dog, and the goose that you take into your house in that old fable just ate the whole family. Because the idea that you could hook into the energy of hatred and exclusion and then just turn it off like a tap when it's no longer useful to you, no, 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 no. Because then they come back carrying a loaded assault weapon at a presidential rally saying this is their right, and carrying a sign saying that the tree of liberty should be watered with the blood of tyrants, and all of a sudden you've got 100 little Timothy McVeighs out there. And you've got an enormous support structure that's actually rooting for them and wishing for it, no matter what they say. And the tail's wagging the dog. And so I think that answer's correct. You know, there's a lot I'm sure I'm saying tonight that isn't correct, but on this one I think I actually got it. Because my buddies like Jack Kemp and Ford, who I knew, would have said, well, you know, for the greater purpose of getting conservative economic principles, supply-side economics, you know, Jack was always about supply-side economics. In my discussions with Jack, just to give an example, he was that kind of Republican, and he would have been saying something like, well, it doesn't matter where the votes come from. The point is, you know, when we get the majority in Congress, or whatever it is they were after at that point, we can do this, this, and this of our real program. And you could see it by the way the pro-life movement was fobbed off again and again. They'd give him a speech on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, I'm all for you. Roe wasn't exactly reversed in all those years. But it was a quid pro quo. The right raised millions of dollars and got lots of people to vote, and so power was served. The issue itself was never dealt with. But what happened is that the lunatics took over the asylum. And I think another part of that is the sort of Neil Postman prophecy coming true. And that is, he talked in his book about entertaining ourselves to death, that, you know, Orwell and Huxley had this opposite vision. Orwell's being that sort of 84 and totalitarianism, Huxley that would become so trivialized, and our attention span would become so short because of the fact we would become an entertainment culture, that you wouldn't have an intellectual structure left to make an analysis that would have the patience to actually see anything through. And I think Postman actually was very perceptive. So I think you combine that with the fact that the lunatics have taken over the asylum, and that's the explanation. As far as the second question goes, remind me again what it was. I told you this would happen.
The religious left.
Oh yeah, the religious left. My heart would be with those guys in terms of agreement with the premise, but I disagree in this sense. What Spong doesn't allow for is something, for instance, I found in my local Greek Orthodox church. And that is, when you are in a group of people who uphold tradition as part of a liturgical cycle, but allow you to approach it philosophically, spiritually, intellectually, any way you want, then the tradition is a form that gives a shape to the community and doesn't have to be dispensed with in order to bring progress or enlightenment. So in my local Greek Orthodox community, I'm not saying this would be so everywhere. Okay, nobody has to go out and run off and join anything. But I'm just saying one of the things that's a relief to me coming from my Protestant background is that the priests are interchangeable. In other words, unlike Rick Warren, who if he dies or does whatever he's not supposed to do, his church will fold. You know, I've been going to this place for 20 years. We've had 7 different priests. The congregation doesn't grow or not grow based on that because everybody was there for the community anyway and the liturgy is important to them because it connects them to their grandparents, and everybody's always done it this way. But I have friends who are atheists and agnostics, literally, who go there because they like being part of the Greek community. I have other people who believe everything literally, and all points in between. And so the fact of the matter is, the conservative form, which is a 4th century liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, doesn't actually, nobody has to conform their belief system to that because you can take it any way you want. So that, you know, you can visit the Getty or the Metropolitan Museum of Art and, you know, you're free to interpret the paintings any way you want, but they don't keep repainting 17th century Dutch art for you to suit your present politics any more than you know, any more than the more radical feminists who never thought certain Shakespeare plays that were misogynistic should ever be performed again. That's not the way to deal with it. The way to deal with it was to say, you can make up your own mind about how you take this play and be honest about what's in it, but you don't have to keep rewriting the book to bring it up to speed. So I think Spong and company would have a hard time, because a lot of religion has nothing to do with religion, has everything to do with the shape of a public space giving a sense of community and continuity in the same way that you don't want to go to a piazza in Italy, in Siena, for instance, and find that it's been replaced by modern buildings, because you know, that sort of defeats the purpose. So philosophically, I would tend to agree with those views. Practically, I think it might be short-sighted and not really relevant to the way most people approach not just faith, but all sorts of traditions, which, if you look at them as an intellectual construct, would be offensive. But if you look at them as an artifact that you participate in for many other reasons, I think there should be a lot of latitude.
And you're in the Greek Orthodox Church. The Eastern Church, of course, doesn't have the Book of Revelation in their Bible.
Right.
That's,
Yeah, and as I point out in my book here, you know, the Eastern churches always look like at the Book of Revelation as sort of Jesus on acid. And so, and it's never read in public and was added very late in the canonical structure of the Scripture over the objections of many of the church fathers in the East, and has always been sort of treated like a poor cousin that once in a while stumbles into a family dinner. But you just know that's just Uncle Fred, and he's always a bit odd. But it's certainly never been folded into the theology of kind of waiting for the end.
the gentleman up in the back there, the third row from the back, with a white T-shirt. No, there it is. It's on your right. Yes, the microphone's right there.
God, I didn't know I would be picked. What is your, I just curious, there were apparently some scriptures that were found in a urn, and they, when I understood it, is that they represent a group of believers that were systematically expunged from the Christian church, and they believed in some sort of maybe, I'm not sure exactly what, but what is your, assuming you understand what I'm talking about.
I think I do.
What do you think about those?
Well, as long as the urn wasn't in Milwaukee.
Or upstate New York.
Or upstate New York. Now resting comfortably in a vault in you know, the Mormon Tabernacle. But no, you're talking about, there's various things like the Gnostic Gospels and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of threads running through Christian and all religious tradition, and obviously get shut out because the victor always writes the history. So when you look at what's in the Bible, it's only canonically the Bible, because somebody at some point said, that's it, we're shutting the door. And there's all sorts of gospel writings and epistles and other books that are of equal age, but they didn't fit a doctrinal model of what the church decided, okay, this is the shape. Sort of like zoning in a Swiss village, where the Swiss villagers say, we build chalets here, and so they're all going to have this shape because this is what we do. And at a certain point, you close the door on it and say, if you want to go live in another kind of a building, you have to move down to the valley where you're allowed to build more than 3 stories, and it doesn't have to have a little slanted roof. And some of it was just practical. But I think that there, again, I think if you look at the whole teaching, you know, Origen, for instance, who was a church father, is regarded by, this is what I like about the Eastern Orthodox, by the way, he's regarded as a church father and a heretic at the same time, because he had ideas which, you know, and then on the other hand, you know, he's this great church father. Protestants don't do things like that. It's you're in or you're out. But I think that, yeah, to be honest, the Christian tradition is incredibly muddy, as is the Jewish and all other religious traditions. The Hindus solve it by just including everybody. You know, you can bring along the kitchen sink, and okay, fine, that's part of the thing. The Christians became more exclusionary as years went on, and then after the Reformation, when you have 2 bodies fighting, then they really had to decide, you know, what the Bible is, and then the Protestants, led by Martin Luther, started even cutting bits of the Catholic Bible out, so now you no longer have the Apocrypha and other books of the Bible, who the Orthodox still include and the Roman Catholics do. So the idea that, you know, this is the Bible as a kind of a specialized document is really just a matter of an editorial decision. You know, if you could talk to all the authors, it would be like a novelist who says, yeah, you know, the damn editor cut 10 chapters. He said it was too long, but, you know, at the time they seemed pretty good to the author. And that's the truth of the matter, I think.
And all of this coming under the umbrella of Jesus, that somehow Jesus would be opposed to women's rights, and Jesus wanted you to carry a gun, and Jesus was opposed to taxes. And I wonder if you could shed a little light on how all of that came to be, because it was quite fascinating as an outsider to see it, but it seems so bizarre. And when you're talking about, you know, the lack of logic and the failure to be able to communicate with people when they believe certain things that you don't believe, I don't know how we ever get over that bridge, if it's possible at all.
Well, I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to start with something a little more encouraging, and that is that in terms of exit polls in the last election, about 20 to 25% of self-identified conservative evangelical young people voted for Barack Obama. So it isn't that, now some of that is his personal charisma, but these are not cast in concrete, which is one of my arguments with some of the new atheists and the way they dismiss religion, because there are these people who have flipped out, and you can't argue with, in fact, but they're not all of them have. And there's an increasing number of young people being raised in the evangelical movement who really see these shortcomings, just as you brought them up, and the inherent contradiction in terms. And so I think there can be a shift. But I think the way it happened is like this, and that is that basically, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so evangelicals just kept swallowing very hard and holding their nose and going along with politicians who would give them access to power. And politicians kept swallowing hard, holding their nose, and going along with any identifiable group, whether it's the NRA or James Dobson's focusing on the family, who will just deliver another bunch of votes. And they can do this, to go back to an earlier point, because once you strip religion of its actual meaning, which is a mystical experience of something greater than ourselves that we call the divine, and you turn it into a set of intellectual, theological premises that you're either in or out, you believe right or you're wrong, then it becomes an incredibly handy tool with which to demonize whoever your opponent is. So rather than just saying, I disagree on this issue, you say, you are against Christ, you are evil, you are working for, you know, dark and terrible powers. And that's how it all got swept together. The Protestant experience in America is one of schism and division. That's why there's 23,000 denominations. Everybody can have their Bible, do their own thing, have their Bible study. What unites them is not belief. What unites them is who they're not and who they stand against. So actually, the political, cultural unity is all they've got. There's no theological unity in the religious circles at all. What they're united against is the other. And that is the other can be the guy who wants to take your gun, and then if you're this guy in Pittsburgh, you shoot 3 police officers because of it. The other can be an abortion doctor. The other can be the Mexican who just crawled through the desert. It doesn't matter. You know, the gay person, whatever. Generally, someone who's you consider to be in a minority to you. But it's always that. There is an aspect that I talk about in Patience with God that I think is true, that's, I think, often overlooked in this, of what pulls these groups together. And here, some of the left and the New York Times, blah, 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 and the media elite do share some of the blame, I think. And that is, there's a tremendous inferiority complex in this group that basically lashes out because they're sometimes ignored or they feel vilified. But this is where this anti-elitism comes from. It's like, well, we can never join that group, so we're just going to hate them.
That's the Sarah Palin stuff. Yeah.
That's the Sarah Palin stuff. And I think if you don't understand the inferiority complex and the chip on the shoulder against the world, you miss the beats that tie all these groups together. But what would unite them all would be the feeling of being outsiders, which of course is ironic since they had their guy in the White House for 8 years and spent the last 35 years controlling off and on, you know, big chunks of Congress and Supreme Court appointments and all the rest of it. But nevertheless, broken into individual pieces, these little group, not little, these large groups individually, all regard themselves as outsiders who are powerless. And so you have that inferiority complex kind of also driving this. And I think those are the elements that contribute to it.
Sounds a bit like Manichaeanism, too.
Right, yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So, right. Yeah, there you go. There you go. In the middle there. The man in the middle.
I'd like to ask you a question about how the Bible affected Western civilization. Now, the philosopher Abernoth Whitehead said, Western civilization is based upon two things. He said what Moses said about God and Aristotelian logic. What do you think about the book, Moses, American Prophet?
You know what? I have not read Moses, American Prophet.
Okay,
so I can't give you an opinion on it.
All right, the next question. In terms of scientists, you look at dark energy or dark matter. I talked to several scientists. They would never consider that there might be a spiritual presence instead of a physical presence. That might be the case. Or it might be another dimension. That how spirituality affects matter. Now, my question is about the Pentecostal movement, which is the largest, fastest growing movement in the world. If you look at what's happening in India, Africa, Asia, South America, and you look at what's happening in Europe, becoming more rationalistic, and Islamic religion is about to take over Europe, certain parts of Europe. And the Pentecostal religion is about to take over the southern part of the continent. So the ecstatic religion, the gentleman mentioned about
Right.
blacks. And I told the scientists, out of all the knowledge in the world, how much do you know? And so one of the things that we claim to know is something that we don't know, even if we're scientists. When you take the method and make it your reality instead of the destination, then you deny what you don't know, and you're making absolute what you don't know. And so your scientific method, and if you look at quantum mechanics, probability, dark matter, chaos, and random thinking, it breaking up is you have a new paradigm of understanding, which is close to spirituality. Would you mind commenting?
Well, there's a lot there. But actually, it's interesting because the points you're making are some things I do talk about in my book, In Patience with God. I have a bit in the book where I say, look, whether it's Dawkins and Hitchens sitting down across from me or Sarah Palin's Pentecostal pastor, if everybody around the table was telling the truth, they would start with the premise that our vision of cosmology and the universe, be it spiritual or hard science, is that of an ant crossing a freeway, brief, no time to really draw any conclusions, read a few books and die, and that where you are, you just see this blur going by, you have no clue whatsoever. If everybody would begin from that position, you alluded to it in this conflict between the general theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. A subatomic particle can be in two places at once, and yet there's a certain predictability in the universe. These things ought to point out only one thing as far as I'm concerned, and that is a sort of a general theory of humility in the face of cosmic issues which cannot divide people because this is just children playing dress up. We know nothing. Now, that doesn't mean I don't believe in science and I don't trust it on a mundane level, but in terms of ultimate destiny, even if you don't believe in purpose, there's no human being who can see the shape of where our species is going and how this will all come out. And we know from our own history how quickly irrelevant both science and religion and philosophy can become in terms of further discovery. And so, I look at it a bit differently. I agree with Dawkins that religion is a human invention, but I don't think that necessarily undermines the idea of spirituality, because what else would it be? We're humans. So to my way of thinking, it's a matter of terminology, and that is there's a difference between invention and discovery. So I think that essentially the whole human journey is a journey of discovery. Nobody invented electricity. Electricity was operational, when we were on all fours and covered with fur. The point is we got to a certain point in our evolution where we understood this was something useful, and we can see how it works. And I look at spirituality in the same way. So I don't think that it's a question of pitting one worldview against another, except in sophomoric, fun discussions that you have over a couple of drinks. But when it comes to seriously trying to make a summing up I think we would do better to make our summing up in areas that either are much more mundane and or leave the door open to just what you were saying, to a level of unknowing which borders on spirituality, whatever your definition is. And that's just my personal view.
Well, Niels Bohr, the physicist, said that there are no secrets in nature, only mysteries.
I think that's it.
And
Exactly.
but the question about the Pentecostals, the questioner brought up, they are really cleaning up in South and Central America, and the Catholics are on their are on their back foot, bringing guitars into the churches to try and spice things up a little bit. You know,
Right.
What's behind that?
What's behind it is the failure of rational science to capture the global imagination, because you cannot, in one hand, tell people that they are nothing with no ultimate purpose and destiny, and then in the other hand say, and by the way, you know, hang on to that and go save the environment and do all these things and make sacrifices on behalf of other people. You know, I believe atheists can be moral people, altruists and all the rest of it. That's not what I'm talking about. But in terms of a movement, it's very hard to capture people's imagination with the abyss and just say, you know, space is big and you are lost, and meanwhile we're going to work down at CERN and try to figure out, you know, what the smallest particles are, and that's it. And basically someone says, painting? Nope, painting's out. And, you know, don't go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and look at anything with religious overtones, because they were either mad or whores bought by the establishment. You know, it's just bigger than that. And so I think that, you know, my hope is 1,000 years from now or so, this discussion will be over, not because we found some great, you know, truth, but because humanity will mature to a point where you don't see these things as mutually exclusive, and that they can coexist. You know, as it were, we don't have to come up with some overriding string theory to tie it all together. We can embrace the paradox of our situation, which is we're in a tiny spaceship hurtling through space. We have no clue. We have this sense that we're more than you know, one branch or other of science can tell us, and more than any theological explanation. And if that's not true, it's certainly a delusion, which is much more pleasant than complete nothingness. And there's something to be said for pleasantness.
A last question here. The lady here in the front. Wait a second for the microphone. Wait, the microphone. It's coming the other way.
Thank you. I have to say, Frank, that your father's book, Art and the Bible, was something quite influential when I was making a search for vocation and decided to be an artist. And I remember that he closed that little book with the phrase that the Christian should be the one whose imagination flies beyond the stars. Am I remembering that correctly?
I think you got it right.
And, you know, as disappointing as it is for me to hear about some of the aspects of how he became embroiled in the religious right, he also was a visionary in many ways. And I just wanted to know if you'd comment on that and
Sure.
his interest in aesthetics and your own.
Yeah, and
Since we are in an art museum.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. In my memoir, Crazy for God, I talk about two aspects of my father that got lost in all this father of the religious right business, which I blame myself for a lot because it was somewhat my ambition. I mean, if you want to get a dad to do something, you know, get a young son who's trying to find direction in his life to say, hey, Dad, let's do this. You know, it'd give me a break. So a lot of this is my fault in terms of his own paternalistic kind of desire to help his son. But I'm glad you bring this up, because let's remember my father wrote a book called Pollution and the Death of Man when it wasn't even on the secular agenda. And he thought industrialization was a disaster, and he wasn't some Luddite romantic. You know, I grew up going around museums with Dad. He took several weeks off and took me to Florence when I was 12, and he says, okay, you know, we're going to start with 10th, 11th, and 12th century work. We're going to look at Masaccio and Giotto. We're going to go from there, up to Siena and look at the paintings there. Then we're going to go down to Florence and do this in order. He believed not only in aesthetics but in art. He would have made a great art historian. And I always describe my dad as someone who was immensely better than his theology as a human being. If you followed the logic of his Calvinism, L'Abri would have been a very harsh, exclusionary place. I grew up with gay people all around me. And Dad wasn't telling him to change because you accept Jesus and this will heal you. He was never like this. There were all sorts of, it was an open community in that sense. And so my father's life, I think, this is sort of a footnote to the whole evening, but it's a good place to end. You were saying this is the last question. I think ended in a tragedy, really, because if he had lived a little longer, I'll give you one little story. It's getting late, but what was the name of that crazy lady who wanted to exclude gay people from education in Florida?
Sarah Bryant. Yeah.
Anita Bryant, yeah. Dad was almost literally on his deathbed in the last couple of years of his life when she was launching all that. And she came and knocked on his door in Rochester, Minnesota, where he was renting a property to do his chemotherapy regime for his lymphoma. And Anita Bryant, he invited her, came in, had dinner with Dad. Well, she left furious because she said to Dad, Francis Schaeffer, you've led the pro-life fight, now you'll join my anti-homosexual campaign. And he said, absolutely not. I think what you're doing is terrible. I'll have nothing to do with it. These are my friends. This has nothing to do with anything. Just because I'm in the pro-life movement doesn't mean I buy into the whole political thing, and so forth. And that's who he was. So the fact of the matter is, I think if he had lived to see where people like Dobson took the whole thing, he would have denounced them roundly. He wasn't afraid to do that. But if you look at his work before his young, stupid, ambitious son got involved with him, who's sitting here now at the age Dad was when I torpedoed him, as it were, having learned some things, you don't hear any of that stuff in his work. So agree or disagree, but he's talking about philosophy, he's talking about art, he's talking about culture. He's not talking about America was a Christian nation, got to stand against the government. That all came in once he, as the British would say, got it up the nose on the political stuff. So in Dad, in a way, and this is a good place to end, you see a kind of a double tragedy, because you see a decent and kind man undone by stupid ideas, a political involvement that ran away with him, speaking about how did the Republican Party get taken over, and then lastly, as a metaphor for a whole movement, for a lot of good, decent, kind, ordinary people who started out trying to love Jesus and be nice to the lady next to them and take her supper because she has dementia, and wound up putting George Bush in the White House twice in a row and killing 4,000 Americans, injuring 50,000, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, and giving us Sarah Palin and Glenn Beck as our future. So therein lies a play that, a future Shakespeare can write.
Well, I thank you so much for joining us, and I'm sure the audience feels the same way.